Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you all for coming. I'm doubly wired up here, one on each lapel, so I'm going to try to stand in front of the lectern because then I can see the slides. And I'm going to talk about Sydney, and particularly the culture of the city. And as Helen acknowledged, we start with Aboriginal Sydney, and in my role as a councillor, I've been to many Welcome to Countries, and they talk about the Eora Nation, the lands of the Eora Nation, and they talk about the bounding of the rivers, the Hawkesbury, the Nepean and the Georges rivers to the south. And that of course describes the Cumberland Basin. This is from Nearmap, so you see a sort of current technological version as opposed to the Aboriginal understanding of this geographic entity, which is such a powerful presence for all of those of us who live in Sydney. But there have been lots of ways of, in fact, relating the territory of the Cumberland Plain. I want to talk quite a lot about the territory of the city, and these are taken from the County of Cumberland plan of the 1950s. In fact, this might be from the original from the late 40s. And they also looked at the geology of the site and the terrain or the relief of the site. And you can see the great creek systems of the west going up to Windsor, obviously the harbour, Broken Bay, Botany Bay, and then Port Hacking to the south, which goes all the way up, as you can see here, to Liverpool. So it really describes the geographic entity of the Cumberland Basin and Sydney. And this was an area that was was very quickly assimilated by Europeans when they occupied the Cumberland Plain. There is actually a plan from 1792, but I found this one from 1813, which is of course before they crossed the mountains. And you can see that they already had pretty well staked their claim over what they considered to be terra nullius over the territory, and you can see out to the Hawkesbury here and the South Creek system up to Windsor here. But the talk is titled From Site to Society. And I recall, obviously, having grown up in Sydney, the influence of architects like Glenn Murcutt and particularly Richard Laplastriere talking about the importance of site. But conversely, I remember Peter Davidson, also a Sydney architect and the designer, of course, of Federation Square in Melbourne, giving a talk with a comment which I found quite puzzling. I asked him about it. He said, I think site's completely overvalued in architecture. And in fact, I think site's probably never been more particular in architecture. And of course, every single site that you get as an architect is unique. Every single spot on the planet is unique. Every ecosystem is unique. And we live in the period, in a sense, the revenge of nature with climate change, human-induced climate change. And so the conditions of the ground are actually changing in response to our inaction or, in fact, our poor actions. So I want to talk about the territory. And I have a number of quotes. I'm not sure if just because of time, and I always put too much in the talk, so I might not actually read out the quotes. So if you maybe read them, I will pause on those quotes. But a leading French landscape architect, Alexander Chemetov, and he talked about the importance of the territory, and he talked about the importance of, in fact, making the projects, and the projects, in a sense, the values are derived from the site. And that's very much the position which I will put, and I think it's very much the position that we have taken in our practice and our projects, and in the collaborations with lots of people, and I'll try to credit the collaborations. But I do want to also mix the history of the city with projects and the cultural understanding of the city. And I would normally have started with Sydney and public Sydney. I'm actually going to start with public Parramatta, because of course it's at the geographic heart of the metropolis. It was understood, in fact it was meant to be the centre of the city. And Alberti, I was just reading Alberti, didn't include his quote. He said the best place to put cities is 10 kilometres from the coast, which is 10 miles from the coast, which is pretty well where Parramatta was, and that was their intent, at the middle of the basin. So they already understood that. And you'll know that there was a first plan of Sydney that we talk about in public Sydney, but the first plan of Parramatta was very similar. And it was based on a 200-foot wide street, which is still there, unlike the centre of Sydney's George Street. And this is the view, which you can still have a version of today, standing in Parliament House's porch, looking east, down George Street to the river. And this is in fact the foundation plan. And so here's Government House, our highlighting of the drawings. 200-foot wide street, which in a sense is the extension of the space of the river itself. Of course, the journey was up the river to Parramatta before Parramatta Road was established. And so you arrived at the Queen's Wharf, which is unfortunately no longer there, but you can see the spot. And the street went straight in and up to the rise, which is where the Governor's House was put. There was also the Cross Street, Church Street, which was marked by St John's Church here, and then the jail and a bridge, which I'll talk about shortly. But there was a very important change, and this also affected the centre of Sydney in around 1805, 1806. So whether it's Governor King or under Bligh, these streets, as they were in the city centre, were narrowed from 200 feet to a much more rudimentary 66 feet. And George Street, in fact, was narrowed. You can also see Church Street being narrowed there. And we don't know exactly why this was done. I've never read anything about it. We haven't been able to research this, and it's a very interesting further dimension of public Sydney that someone else could extend. But I think it's had a devastating impact on our sense of generosity of public space. And of course, if you go to a Melbourne or a Canberra, you'll find that the streets reservations are much more generous. In fact, they're some of the most generous in the world. But that was the aspiration in 1789, and of course that's nothing to do with traffic, it's to do with a sense of place. And when the first Europeans arrived in Parramatta, they actually talked about it being like an English park, which was because of the Aboriginal practices of fire farming, fire stick farming, so it had tall canopy trees and grasslands. And that was the way of the Aborigines managing this. I could have put in some quotes about that. It's a very interesting issue. So very interesting to look at Parramatta. And then we had a project as part of designing Parramatta, but in fact it was a revisit of the project that we'd already undertaken when we did the DCP for Parramatta City Centre in 2000. And that was to look at whether we could interpret the 200-foot width, 60-metre width of George Street, which is still there, and reconnect the city east-west on its spine. And so if you go to George Street, what you'll find even today is that many of the taller buildings are actually built back on that earlier alignment. And generally what occupies the space between the two alignments, and it's not exactly centred, it actually shifts from one end to the other, which we've very accurately plotted. What you find is all the heritage properties. You find some of the significant trees. You find, in fact, a number of the public buildings. And so it'd be quite easy to have a double scale where you actually allow the taller buildings, which are inevitable in a city centre, to come at this scale, but you can still read a secondary scale within the street. And in plan, you can see it here, and in fact, this is the building which the light rail company is in. And they've got a big square in front of them. Here you can see the heritage buildings, trees, this huge fig tree and the like. So it's actually a project which, with vision now, could be implemented very easily. And what it could do is actually create not just the north-south axis of Forward Place, but in fact this wonderful double-scale avenue which talks to both the original foundation plans and then the lived life of the city over the 230 years since that time. So all these buildings, and this is a wall, would be in that space. And so the intention and the drawing that we did for this public Parramatta project, and the projects with the artists Michaela Crawford and Jenny Turpin and Jane Irwin, the landscape architect who just came in. So the project you can see from Government House, the double scaling of the street, the reconnection and reinterpretation of Queen's Wharf, the extension of the river into the town. So the attitude that I bring is not one of being a historian or an architect, it's one of actually trying to fuse culture and fuse an idea of place and make a project for today and into the future that understands the history of the site and projects it forward in a positive way. So it's not a sense of loss, it's a sense of what can we add, how can we make it live today. And of course, there's also the gatehouse in the foreground. There's actually lots and lots of other towers proposed. The other aspect I want to talk about is then our two projects on the riverfront in Parramatta. And so just the other thing to say is, of course, just as the light rail is being put rather inexpertly into George Street in Sydney, There is a proposal to put it in Macquarie Street. It really should run in George Street, and it should run right out to Sydney Olympic Park. If George Street's the most important street, it should actually have the most attention, and the light rail needs space for the stops. In fact, that would work beautifully with this concept, because you could actually insert the stops much more seamlessly than in the other narrower streets of Parramatta. The other very interesting cultural program, and this wasn't in the early plan of Parramatta, where most of the riverfront was in fact private, but Parramatta sits between the park of Parramatta Park to the west and what should be the garden, the actual garden suburb of Rose Hill. It's just a bit short of public space, but we're trying to help council extend that idea. But the great project that Parramatta Council has been, or the City of Parramatta now has been implementing over years, is to reclaim the foreshore as public land. And the two projects that I'll show you is our work on Lennox Bridge, which is complete, and then the escarpment boardwalk, which is actually going to tender tomorrow morning, and there are people in the office working on it now, not me, I'm sorry to say. So Lennox Bridge has got a very interesting history. There seems to have been a bridge there from before 1800, a very early skimpy bridge which kept being lifted and propped. This was the state in 1826, where the bridge was collapsing, had to be propped, and so Lennox was commissioned in 1836 to replace this bridge. This drawing was a point of confusion for us because in fact it's wrong. Lennox's bridge is actually on top of the old bridge, as we found when we started work on this project. And so this is a drawing that actually overlays all the different projects. So we've now very confidently can say, because of the archaeology, that this was the line of the first bridge. Here's Lennox Bridge, which was doubly extended, had a tram line put on it. In fact, he's going to get a new tram line put on it after our project. And we added, at the riverbank level, 2 portals through the bridge, which are pedestrian cycle portals. And when you see the geometry of Lennox Bridge, the curvature of the path is really to create a setting which Lennox Bridge never had. Now Lennox, in 1835, there was discussion between him and the Assistant Surveyor General Perry, where Perry in fact wanted portals and Lennox said he didn't want portals. And they had an argument that went all the way to the Governor, and the Governor said, well, as the foreshore is all private land, with the exception of this side, we won't put portals in. Of course, this is the argument we have again in 2010 when we started this project again, and in fact now all the riverbanks are public land, and in fact the bridge is a blockage to the public land, and so the portals were the preferred solution. But you can see that when we inherited a feasibility study by Arup, the idea was to take the portals straight through these curved sides. We in fact displaced them to the outside of Lennox's geometry, and I'll show you why. And then in particular in here, we actually found the footing of the original 1803 or 1797 bridge. In fact, we think there's the footing of the older bridge inside the enlarged footing, which is within Lennox's wall, which we dismantled. And so then this is a photo of that's the northern end, there's the southern end, where in fact we found Lennox's western wall, which had been hidden from it since 1935 by a DMR wall, a main roads wall, when they widened the bridge at that time. So really the portals are a section through time, and we wanted to make that apparent. So when we had to actually cut through Lennox's walls, we actually cut through with surgical precision so that it's a new intervention. And in fact, there's a 2-ton stainless steel shelf angle, which is an interesting detail. And because the Heritage Council said this is basically over our dead body, one of the conditions was that in fact the bridge, which was in a very sort of dilapidated state, was restored, and with Design 5 we reinstated the balustrade and cleaned the bridge forensically. So it's probably in the best state it's been since about 1840 in terms of its cleanliness and the sandstone. And so you can see then the curvature, the curtilage for the project, and then the portal. And so we aligned the portals at this point because we didn't have to cut at this point. This is where, in fact, it was unbonded connection. We inserted the lintel, so we didn't have to cut the stone there. We only cut this side. It's like a surgical extraction. And there's no new fabric other than 2 centimetres of steel lintel on the face, and it's on the outside of Lennox's curved walls, which was influenced. He'd worked for Telford, the great English engineer. So very short version of the long story, but Parramatta, we think, has actually got probably the best urban waterfront in Australia. And this was actually a photo we found on social media of 10,000 people on the riverfront with the portals operating, which of course lets people enjoy, connect from one end to the other, and allows the foreshore to grow, so it's not a confined space. At the eastern end, now about to go to tender, is the sort of yang to that yin, which is a 500-metre boardwalk, of which 250 metres is actually suspended over the water in this S-bend, and then it goes to land under a heritage bridge, MacArthur Street Bridge, where there's a place and an artwork by McGregor Coxall, this project, also with Jane Irwin, and then connects to the existing path system. And then we've had to re-document it because there's been this is in concrete to withstand ferry impact. There's now an upper walkway in metal which cantilevers over the lower one. And so you can see the curve of the lower walkway and then the more miniaturised curve of the upper walkway above it. And so while one project is a project of historical excavation, this is a project of addition. They're completely contrasting in almost all of their values. But what they will do is take this maroon part of the riverbank and in fact extend it into Greater Parramatta, allow connections to the University of Western Sydney and the like. And so it's very important in intervening in one of the only places where shale is visible in Sydney. And so these are cut shale cliffs, but you'll be able to go there and see the construction in due course, we hope. We're actually fascinated by the material of Sydney, and we see the city as a resource. We also have been, through our teaching and research, forensically trying to find the great foundation projects of the city. And this is one we're particularly keen on. Coogee, which is actually a plan by Sir Thomas Mitchell, the Surveyor General, in 1836, redone in 1856. And it has this most extraordinary relation to its topography. This is a cross-section that our students at UTS drew through Arden Street, which is one of the steep streets in Sydney. And this is a aptly named street, Beach Street, which actually has a beach in it. And so these sorts of streets, there's a lot of criticism that these streets don't follow the topography. In fact, the Americans call these, if you go to San Francisco, they call them section streets because they're streets that in fact reveal, and they're challenging physically to walk around, but they reveal the topography. And so it's fitted quite precisely to the Coogee Basin. In fact, all the foreshore was reserved as public land. You can see the creek line, which is a series of parks. You can see the Coogee Bay Road is in fact centred on the beach. You need to look at these plans, you need to look at the city, you need to find the good projects, you need to understand why the pieces of the city actually are good relative to other parts of the city, and you need to assimilate them into a cultural attitude to site and to the construction of the city and in fact architecture. And it's something that's fascinated us our entire career from when we won the Olympic Village, a project which we then developed with quite a host of people. Our team had Peter John Cantrell, David Hirsch, Peter McGregor, Philip Arnold, but Rod Simpson, Andy Wilson, Andrew Burgess were other winners. So this is a collaboration which was the official Sydney bid scheme, and it sought to interpret the armaments depot at Newington and keep all the lowlands as park. So the thing about the site, and it had a ridge road, of course. Flood, I talked about the Cumberland Basin and the intelligence of the Macquarie towns where they're actually sited, they thought, above the floods, almost above the floods, but in fact Windsor's rebuilding the earlier township had been washed away in floods after 1795. And in fact this sort of underlying landscape and topography, sorry, I've just inadvertently put the Shemetov quote in twice, but it fits in a couple of places, so if you missed reading it the first time, you can read it the second time. But this is a precursor to another project that we showed, and this is a drawing that Sheila in our office is obsessed by topography and Mitchell's plans, and so she's been working away at this drawing for years. So this is, of course, the eastern suburb from the harbour, from Circular Quay, and the topography. And a very interesting story of topography, of course, where the Europeans, within a couple of days of landing at Circular Quay, Sydney Cove, had gone down to visit the French at La Perouse, and they followed the ridge line. They followed Oxford Street, along here, Old Southhead Road. You can see the ridge of Bondi Junction, down what's called Bronte Road, Perouse Road, Frenchman's Road, in fact around the headland of Coogee and then down here. Now that's certainly an Aboriginal track. And in fact Aboriginal Sydney and all the ridge roads of the city are almost certainly the sense of the territory. What that also does, of course, is define what drains to the harbour, which is actually Oxford Street, everything north of Oxford Street to the harbour, everything south to this aquifer on which we are standing at the moment, which is University of New South Wales, and so this water system. And this was of great interest to us in the project that we did and won the competition last year for K to K, Kingsford to Kensington, or was it Kensington to Kingsford, interchangeable. And you can see that that project is on this piece of territory of the city. What you can see is one of our few grand avenues that organise the space of the city, Anzac Parade, and it is puzzling to us why there aren't more organising avenues. We're not talking about traffic here, we're talking about the character of public streets organising the territory. But equally, there's another line which is very important here, which is the creek line, which came through here. And so our project with JMD Design and Bennett and Trimble, rather than simply stacking the density on the main road, which seems to be a Sydney disease, why put the greatest number of people where there's the least amenity? Where there's actually the greatest amenity, but also the need for repair, is on the former Mill Creek alignment. And so by making this more generous, we'd relieve the flooding which afflicts all of this area, including the university, and make a place to live actually in a far better urban environment. And this could be done either by acquisition or by, in fact, development agreements. And so here you can see that while there was some increase along Anzac Parade in order to make squares, in fact, this parallel move, and talking to Helen about the need for a cycleway to get to the university as well, which was part of the plan. There are a number of quotes that I've included about the importance of site. And siting architecturally is critical to Sydney, and so of course this lighthouse, Barnett's copy of the Greenway original, Greenway predicted it would fall down when it did. And this was really the internet of its age, because this was the point at which ships approaching Sydney, they relayed this message back into the city. And it also announced, so it announced the presence of Sydney to the wider world, and people who'd been at sea for months. But it also announced back into the city that news from abroad was coming. So it's extraordinarily symbolic, and we perhaps don't appreciate that symbolism. But of course, architecturally, it's emphatic in its form, it's emphatic in its siting, and there's this extraordinary dialogue with that greatest of public work, I think the greatest public work of the 20th century architecture, the Opera House. But what's not often understood about the Opera House, everyone talks about the shells, I want to focus a bit more on the base. And this is in fact the condition that Utzon inherited. And what you'll notice with his podium is he's virtually, this is the timber boardwalk, which is turned into the Western Promenade. He's actually kept the alignment of the head park. The only place is encroached in order to, and he was the only scheme to actually have the two halls side by side. And so the only place he's had to encroach is on this western side, where in fact there was a ferry dock. So otherwise Utzon has in fact kept very faithfully to the footprint of the land without encroachment. And then the other thing about this fantastic podium is its relationship to the sandstone cliff. Of course, he originally wanted it in sandstone, but he changed his mind, and everyone focuses on the shells, but just looking at the podium again, this incredible generous gesture to the city. Hard to think of a public building that has such a generous outlook to the city. How many of you will have been to concerts where you stand or sit on the stairs, others where you're in fact on the flat and the stage is used as a stair? This thing that is beyond function, which is just such a gift to Sydney, and hard to be pessimistic despite everything in Sydney with such a building. We of course, I think many people of our generation have struggled to have major public buildings. I remember when we graduated to our first public toilet after 20 years of practice, which is what I'm about to show you at Pyramid Park. Of course, it's part of a fantastic 2 hectares of a 4 hectare park at the end of Harris Street. We often think of Macquarie Street having the main public buildings in Sydney. In fact, Harris Street's got it just as many. Think of ABC, UTS, Sydney Technical College, the Powerhouse, the council buildings, the pool, other buildings along the street up to the community building, and then we had the last public building, but also on the prompting of Richard Laplastria, hollowing out the waterfront, as I'll show you, to make this bay, and in fact taking the structure out so that Harris Street would finish in the waterfront again. So here's our sort of ephemeral public building, this canopy. As we always tend to do, rather obsessively, we researched the site from its earliest subdivision plan of 1836, which proposed a very upmarket residential area, through its various incarnations of industry, through its condition in the Second World War, where in fact it had been requisitioned. The demolition of the baths happened just at the end of the war, and then the overlay of all of those different parts together. And so trying to understand it as I think many people have called it a sedimentary city, the city on the city. And so which of those elements would we interpret in our project? And interestingly, when we took this to public consultation, everybody liked the idea of, if not a beach, which was impossible to recreate, at least a bay that allowed people to come down to the waterfront. And so that's what was hollowed out at this point. But in fact, there's a number of elements, and one of the key organising ones is the retention of some of the industrial archaeology, which is on the line pretty well of the original shoreline, and that we'd have a grove of native trees, Sydney red gums on the land, and then on the relatively flat area of reclaimed land, we'd have exotics, the fig trees and the like. So this contrast of nature and culture that actually comments on the place. Here we'd have a more urban termination to Harris Street, and then a stair, which I'll also show you here. So just quickly to cut through to the elements. So the retention of the dock wall as the promenade, a choice of different ways that we'd seen. The fantastic Glebe promenade actually was too successful, couldn't cope with the amount of people, so you needed a certain dimension. And so it also gives you multiple routes. Of course, the bay, we didn't realise how many people would love to dive in it, but in fact it's very popular, and swimming in the harbour, as the port moves, swimming in the harbour will be a major activity. But whether it's a human or a dog, it's great. This staircase, which we cantilevered off the sandstone. Of course, Pyrmont has a great culture it's a great quarry of the city. And so we wanted to make a staircase that touched the ground lightly. In fact, it's completely supported off the cliff as a cantilever, so it had to be documented and re-documented when the bolt holes were actually surveyed and re-engineered. And new shop drawings. The canopy, which is an ephemeral public building at the end of Harris Street, with the necessary services and a cafe underneath with a belvedere above. And you can see the section of it there on Harris Street, and then this belvedere at the upper level that looks out over the park, and the canopy roof, which is uplit. Another project that takes the site as its starting point, and I'll only show you from a distance here, is Sydney University Boathouse, where it's in a park. In fact, it's over the water where the boathouse had previously been. It's a shed, basically, an undecorated shed, where the different lengths relate to the different sizes of boats, and the different apron lengths relate to the boats coming out and being stored inside and outside. The geometry is about the boats launching down the bay, but the upper level is about the view through the middle of the building to up this gully and in fact to Chatswood. And so you can see the view down the bay where the boats leave, and then the view through the upper level where in fact there's a far smaller amount of program upstairs than downstairs. So the amenities on one side and the common rooms on the other side here. So a very tight building with a ramp up through the middle. Some architectural antecedents which I won't go into here, but you can guess for yourself. I want to talk about some houses. We don't normally talk about some houses, and Laura Harding is hiding somewhere in here. And so these are two houses but that we'll show. But this interest in, I've only included, because I already had too much material, I've only included these very brief images on the temple of Poseidon at Sunyon. I don't know how many of you will have been there. But this is a Beaux-Arts rendering of the temple of Poseidon, and what it showed is this is the gatehouse, the altar and the temple, and you look at this and you think, perfectly orthogonal, very Roman, not very Greek at all. And that's how the Beaux-Arts thought in terms of these axes. But there's another way of looking at it. If you know Constantine Doxiadis' book, his doctoral thesis, where in fact he said that these are meant the visual cones on either 30 degrees or 36 degrees, relating to either the Ionic or the Doric order. And the Greek temples were actually meant to be seen as bodies in space. Thought of this way, you look along the face of the columns at the front and they appear as almost solid. You're looking down a series of columns catching the sun. And then you're looking through the columns of the long side here. You also see it as a body against the sky. And then there's the movement up the hill to the temple. So I always find this fascinating that there's actually two readings you can apply to the same physical place. And it's something that we then tried to apply in a couple of houses, which I won't say exactly where they are, but you probably can guess if I just go quickly. This is the layout of a house on site, and you can see that it's actually oriented to the point where the land meets the water. So that's the axis of it. That's partly necessity because bushfire actually pushed it over to the southern side of its lot, and so we couldn't have gone any further north. So that determined a linear house, and it's a house that goes from one story actually dug into the rear to elevated at the side, but is in fact on the level on the cross axis. So the plan looks regular. Pieces haven't shown up on the plan. So the plan is actually organised orthogonally, a bit like a Merkert house in terms of two pavilions, a living pavilion and a bedroom pavilion, but there's also this cross-axis on the level, and but then it's also got diagonal views. So sorry, there's just meant to be, this is all meant to be highlighted in the drawing, but hasn't come through. So the house can be understood orthogonally from side on, but it also can be understood as oblique views capturing landscape and through it, including underneath it. So the living room orthogonally, and then the oblique views to the escarpment, which are framed views by the structure. So it's very disciplined in its organisation and in the method of construction, but I'm just focusing here on the framing of the views and the framing of the elements. So again, the multiple views down the cross-axis and the longitudinal axis, and then this is the side axis on the level through the house. Another house which we started before but only just finishing now, and we'll actually read this, I'll let you read the quote from Teresa Moller. It's about the line in the landscape, which is very much something that we're, the organising line, the alignment, the importance of these things. And the biggest line here is the horizon. So we call this horizon house. And you come actually from above, unlike the other house where you come from the side. And you, in fact, descend into the house from above. But it's also about alignment because it's on the spur. And then the north-south axis is in fact to the main streets of two towns which have pine trees in their main towns. And so they're captured again, those lines have disappeared here. This is the line of the ridge and this is the urban line between the towns through this gallery. Two bedroom wings and a living room wing on the eastern side. The house under construction reminded us of a Greek temple. It was like a reverse Greek temple. So in fact Jono Temple was involved in, by coincidence the name, the construction of these columns, and which were meant to have screens, which he beautifully documented. So this is the view town to town, and this is the view through the living room to the horizon, and we just need the full moon rising there, but we'll get there. So I'm just going to give you I think Laura's actually speaking in Newcastle about the house more extensively tomorrow, which is the first time we've showed it, but if you go to Newcastle you can hear that. And so you can see the importance of the landscape and the subtle canting of the facade and the geometry of rooms to relate to views down to coves and the like. Of course, we have actually done houses, and we've been interested in the houses from the very first house with Peter John in Northbridge, this pair of houses where we had the idea of two orthogonal pavilions, a square house and a rectangular house. The surveyor kept moving this tree over, which was unfortunate, and so this house became deformed around the Angophora, which is still in the middle, but what that meant is that you got this courtyard space where you came up, which is the entry to the two houses. So you come up between the houses and you go back into each of their entries. And it was an early dual occupancy, Sept 25, people might remember those. The whole street objected to it and the like, so I guess we've been used to controversy since our first projects. But We're probably more known for apartment buildings, and certainly we've done a lot more apartment buildings than houses, something like 75 at the moment. And so these are a selection of them, all drawn to the same scale in plan and section. And we are a little bit obsessive about these. It's probably an understatement, but what we're particularly interested in, the reason I show apartment buildings here is that it's really the relationship of the lot. And I think even though SEP 65 has got a lot of positives, I think in fact it could be much stronger again. And it doesn't emphasise site planning, and I think its benchmarks are way too low. So here we tend to do this for all of our projects. So this is actually not the final building. It actually went up in floor space to about 1.7, 6 stories, 100% cross ventilation, 100% getting 3 hours sun. What's the excuse for not doing that? Why have substandard housing? Why is the benchmark at 60 and 70%? Particularly in suburban positions, that's pathetic. 2 stories of basement under the building footprint. This site's only 776 square metres and it's on a triangle on a curve. So it's a challenging site on a main road. And it's on Old Southhead Road, which has this very particular bend. And it's quite remarkable. There's not a single building on Old Southhead Road that actually relates to the curve of the street. And we thought in terms of siting, that's a bit ridiculous. And of course, if you think of curved buildings in Sydney, you particularly think of this building by Bolo, which I've shown to students in lectures for decades, so it's no surprise we looked at it as well. And this is our contemporary building. And we were very surprised in putting the presentation forward that in fact Bolo's plan has exactly the same depth, or should I say shallowness, as ours. So that's his oriented to northeast and ours oriented to northwest. But the other very important principle which Bolo adopted in a number of his apartment buildings, and we've found 11 so far, is that it gives you the long side with the amenity where all the served rooms in Khan's terms are, so the bedrooms, the balconies and the living rooms, and on the back he put all the servant rooms, and so the kitchens, bathrooms and stairs. We slightly inverted that to put the kitchens on the facade, the bedrooms at the back, because we had a noisy street and we had very small units, but these are open galleries. But the other principle here is that you give to the sun the longer facade and to the south the shorter facade. And having more perimeter to north is a very important site planning principle. So here's the building in the street. It's got a sandstone base, which is so typical of Sydney. We even convinced the developer, he reused a lot of the stone, which is a first for him. And then you can see as it relates to people walking around the curve, the building's built in concrete, very well built in concrete. And then it has the idea of the kitchens as these glass boxes on the facade, which are orthogonal elements set against the curve. I won't show too many apartment buildings, but this is a very suburban one. I've deliberately put it in terms of it's in West Chatswood. It's part of a larger aged care. It's this independent living unit, so there's an aged care building with the public library, and there's a public park that retained the trees, so we're involved in the site planning. And then its character, it's quite diminutive, it's 3 stories, and its character, it fits in is what the planners would like to say. It's not a term I usually use. But in terms of the site planning, it's based on amenity. And so there are 3 north-facing courtyards, 2 halves and a whole one in the middle. There are 2 south-facing courtyards which are heavily planted, which have the stairs. Every apartment faces north. Every apartment looks into the garden areas. There are 2 veranda spaces in the middle, and every apartment is cross-ventilated. What's the excuse at this density? And this is particularly important for older people who actually need the vitamin D, they need the sun, but who doesn't? So no excuse for not actually having apartments. If you design apartments that you aren't prepared to live in, well then why are you designing them at all? And that's what we say to developers time and again, be it on council like last night or to our clients. And then the south facade, so the north facade is, and east and west is far more articulated, and the south facade much plainer. A big distinction between the character of the communal parts, open verandas, stairs that encourage people to walk up them. You can build open stairs, you can build inviting stairs even for the elderly. So quite a clear character. But in fact, we want to extend that idea further, because really we should be talking about amenity of housing. If apartment buildings are going to be where the population lives, where you get large numbers of people living, we've got to think about them being in the best position and of the best form. And this is an analysis that we published in Architecture Australia for a planning project which lapsed, so I'm not going to say where it was. But 100 existing dwellings around a real park. This is an actual example, this is an actual survey. If you replace them with 6-storey apartment buildings with a 10-metre average frontage, you could have more than 1,000 dwellings facing this park. The existing houses are basically single storey, so they're oriented to their backyard, and in fact they hardly can see the park because of they're at street level and there's cars in the way and there's front fences. Of course the edge of the park is quite dilapidated, so if you used the uplift here to fund improvements of the park, you could underground the wires and plant real trees, you could accommodate the parking interspersed with the landscape, and every living room would have a view of the park for surveillance and amenity. And while they'd have a small courtyards, the public life of the city would be improved. This is real planning as opposed to the colouring in of zones and the like, which is just such a manifest failure. And so why can't we have this dignified mid-rise urbanity across metropolitan Sydney, rather than this crude, winners and losers and 20 and 30 and 40-storey towers for the mates who go and see the minister? More about that later. I'll quickly go through some, and how am I going, Helen? I'm already over time? I probably am. I'll just go through a couple of projects in Canberra that we've been doing with Jane for 5 or 6 years. There's 3 projects, and they're all in the Griffin core of the city. And I won't read Jurgela's fantastic comment in praise of Griffin, but if you want a city that's actually planned on site and landscape principles, Canberra is the great exemplar, as Jurgela recognised, and in fact other people like James in this audience recognise. I'm always nervous to show Canberra projects when James is in the audience. Of course, the original perspectives by the Griffins had the Parliament House on the hill, the organisation of the axes, the organisation of the basins, whereas Canberra, really in the post-war period, has retreated from the Griffin legacy and has left, in fact, large swathes of the city centre empty, effectively, but it still has this incredible landscape setting and this incredible afternoon light. If you're ever there in winter's afternoon with the sun on the Angophores, is quite remarkable. Griffin's project just continues to amaze us, looking at the way that he structured this, and we've got so few of the Griffin legacy, there's so few, James, over 100 drawings out of something like 600 that Griffin produced, so we don't have 5/6 of his actual thinking and detailed work on the city. But this one's particularly interesting, which highlights the avenues, and the avenues of course intended for light rail, which is finally happening in Northbourne Avenue at the moment and will hopefully extend down to Woden. But also you'll notice things like the urban quays at Yarralumla, and there was also one here at Kingston at the end of Tilapia Park, and a further one over here to the west, and this is the causeway, which hasn't been completed. And so because only 2 have been completed as roads, main roads, Griffin in fact proposed 4 crossings of the lake, which would have been far more strategic. We've been fascinated by Griffin's legacy, and so this is a drawing that Ben Driver in Alpha has prepared, which actually shows you the different elements, the Griffin parts that were made and are still there, the ones that were partially made. Can you believe that some have actually been removed? And in particular the narrowing of London Circuit, the removal of Garden Terrace, and also the change in alignment of Constitution Avenue. We've been lucky to have these succession of projects, so Campbell Section 5, all with Jane, Constitution Avenue, City of the Lake, Yarralumla Brickworks, which we're hopefully doing a couple of buildings within. So you see that these projects, basically, this is their site. You're talking about knocking down the odd shed and removing an enormous amount of car parking and reversing the obsessive road engineering of the post-war period. And wouldn't that be good in all Australian cities rather than building it? Griffin's work, he actually proposed that the public foreshore, that it wouldn't just be a park, that it'd actually be full of public buildings. He did have the urbanity coming to the foreshore here. He did have this very strong geometry of the curves, and we've been obsessive in trying to work that out. But also there are these drawings. So this is Anzac Parade, and he actually produced these subdivision drawings. And subdivision is so important because he's really saying that the density principle is where you have the smaller lots in the lanes, that's where you're going to have the more intense parts. So it's like a shorthand, and people don't understand subdivision as this critical layer of city making, which Griffin manifestly understood and mastered. So our project seeks to interpret, it doesn't reinstate Griffin, but it's certainly, this is the curve exact, as far as we can work out, the exact curve of Griffin's foreshore. Constitution Avenue is this street, which is a separate project, largely completed, $45 million project. Campbell Section 5, the public domain, is largely completed, is complete, though being destroyed by the construction of speculative apartment buildings. Constitution Avenue is here, so the character of the avenue, it's different parts from the city centre part, and John Golling's beautiful photo. So finally, after 100 years, someone has tried to actually do Griffin justice and make a grand avenue in Canberra. Having said that, the footpaths along here are still not completed, which is, I think, really erodes the reading of this avenue. But nonetheless, we think there's a lot of things that are quite crucial. Absolutely crucial is the extension for the first time up to City Hill. So these avenues were curtailed and didn't extend to the City Hill. So City Hill becomes a park which is actually included in the landscape of the city. With this missing link, and Jane's equally proposed Edinburgh Avenue be extended up, and so that the freeway through the city be removed and it be turned into a boulevard. So this is an early version of the plan, and then we worked up the foreshore. Quite an ambitious plan. In buildings that comply with the height limit, 25 and 50 metres, 1.3 million square metres of developable area. That's double crappy old Barangaroo. Plus an urban stadium, plus a pool, plus a convention centre, plus public amenity, plus public space. Don't find that at Barangaroo. We'll come to that. And so then these are the developed drawings of the promenade. And can you believe that this bit's actually under construction? On our national foreshore, there's a D&C waterfront. And we had some involvement in the doing detailed sketch drawings for the promenade, but Jane was excluded from the park and we don't even know what's being done. This is on our national capital foreshore. That's for another talk. So these are the drawings about procurement. These are the drawings of the conception. So the promenade, these series of pavilions that frame a series of squares. The grand sweep, 600 metres of this boardwalk, of which they built about the first 100 metres, hopefully to very high quality, and then encapsulating the landscape of this very beautiful landscape of Canberra. So I did say that I would also talk about society, and of course our book Public Sydney is about society. It was written in some ways as an antidote to our adventures on Barangaroo, but it was also written and came from work, and some of you had to suffer our classes and public rooms, public space. Michael Zanato is hiding in the middle, but there's a number of other you in the room. And so that was the class we taught at UTS, but we thought it was a celebration of all things public, and in a sense it was the antidote to the privatisation of the city that was Barangaroo. We've been told that it's the only book on the Premier's coffee table, and we didn't know how to understand that, but we now think that it's being used as a sales brochure because they didn't actually know what they owned and what they can flog. So we think that the next version should be called Privatised Sydney, with a big red privatised banner, because in fact this is one of the great challenges of our time. We do often talk about parts of Public Sydney, but I want to focus for today on the infrastructure part, which is this incredible work of public works, the Harbour Bridge. So the Opera House, on one headland, the greatest work of public architecture of the 20th century, on the other headland, the greatest work of engineering, urban engineering of the 20th century, and the greatest paradigm of multimodal public transport. A great quote from Solomon Morales about doing infrastructure well. And we shouldn't have any excuse because this is the best piece of infrastructure. Why? And Bradfield, this is Bradfield's vision. This is actually from his doctoral thesis where he said that the bridge would actually need to be supplanted with another bridge within 80 years. Well, they built the harbour tunnel exactly 80 years after, as he predicted, because of traffic flow. But this is, he actually turned all of his projects for Sydney into his doctorate, Sydney University. And he also had an urban conception, even though he was an engineer. So these are earlier versions of the bridge with the terrace at Lavender Bay, and then the office buildings at the city, so you'd come into the city. And so this is the 1912 scheme with a railway and the bridge. Changed the scale of Sydney, this dramatic piece of organisation and construction between 1923 and 1932, reaching across to, some people say to join the sides of the harbour. Lloyd Rees said to cut the harbour in half, an east and west harbour. I think both a bit like Lennox's bridge. Bridges are like that. But imagine the drama of being in Sydney when this was built, and I hope there's a little microcosm with the Cloud Arch in Sydney, which might be a miracle in the centre of our city, but I won't talk about that today. Of course, it had many modes. It had on the eastern side tram lines, which few people in the audience would remember. I don't, but these photos are freely available. And so on the northern side, in fact, Milson Point was a twin station removed for the Cahill Expressway. But what you also find on the northern side is that the stations were elevated and the road goes into a cutting. The approach is on a curve. Think of Solomon Morales' scenic qualities of public works. And that there was not only this concrete bridge, which is still there, but this steel arch bridge as a companion to it, which is removed for the Warringah motorway, and the connection right up to North Sydney Station, which is actually part of the same project, right through the cutting to Waverton, is part of the same project. That was a tram bridge. This drama of crossing the bridge every day and looking into the structure, and you can then see the contrast to the south side, which is dead straight on approach. And what happens is the reverse, that the trains go into cuttings and into tunnels and the road is elevated above them. And so the scenography of it, and here you can see the trams go into the lost platforms at Wynyard, which are tragically used as a car park currently. But these were intended by Bradfield for the Northern Beaches Railway, which is a much better idea than a Northern Beaches motorway. And then how it fitted into the city. And of course, Wynyard Station is part of the same project. And so we were one of the best cities in the world of building public transport up to this project of the bridge. And the city circle, not fully delivered at that time. Circular Quay wasn't built till after the war. But it was an extraordinary work of public commitment to city making. And of course, this is a drawing from Public Sydney, because the other element is the public park, Bradfield Park, on the headland, and these remarkably generous parks looking up at the superstructure of the bridge on the headland. Bradfield couldn't have imagined that at periodic intervals Sydney would close the bridge just to celebrate its presence. As an engineer, he couldn't have imagined that we would have draped it with fireworks every New Year's. What's that about? That 1 million people would come to see the bridge turned into this enormous scaffold of celebration of this minor event that happens every year. But nonetheless, that it seems to have assumed some great meaning. So these works, like the Opera House, these generous works of public investment and public imagination, actually allow the city to develop in ways which none of us as authors can imagine. And that's a good thing. That's one of the great joys of being an architect. However, today we find the exact opposite. What is the sense of West Connects? What is the sense of, in fact, not just West Connects, you can go North Connects, you can go Beach Connects, you can go Badgerys Connects, you can go M9, which is a great Northern Road duplication, you can go F6, which is M6. Why are we doing this? When all intelligent cities stopped building motorways in the 1950s, why are we having this orgy of motorway construction now in order to enrich private companies who, in fact, they're not even building them anymore. The government will actually take the risk and just hand over the profit. This is a complete distortion of real transport planning towards private profiteering. And it is one of the things we need to stop, and we have a huge civic responsibility to fight to stop this atrocity being visited on our city. And so obviously the City of Sydney, which I'm involved in, as Helen said, is campaigning for an alternative, and these are the montages that the city has done, which are faithful to the plans. That's the St Peter's so-called interchange. That's Sydney Park, of the same size. Why are we building these things today? And is this actually the best we can do in 2017? I don't think so. We need to stop the current New South Wales government obsession with motorways. Because really it's just the dumb stuff of the 1950s revisited on us, as if the territory, as if the site didn't matter. Sure, it might be underground, but it has a completely scarifying effect on metropolitan territory. And we know that it doesn't work anyway. This is how much space, 1,000 cars, 15 buses, 4 light rail carriages, maybe if there's sensible length, not the street trains, an 8-car train set, maybe a couple of metros in between. We can't afford, it's not only the pollution, it's not only the spatial distortion of the city, we simply can't afford the space of the cars. It's not just when they're moving, it's when they're parked not only at either end, but at other places in between. Not only on the streets, in shopping centres and like. The cost of cars in the city spatially doesn't get criticised anywhere near enough. And of course, I could have put in a dozen of these. There are so many. Here's the cars, here's the people, here's a bus, here are the bikes. Come on, all the other cities in the world are getting this. Why are we being so slow, so tardy on understanding city making and the transport's role? And here's a fantastic quote. I contrast this with Tony Abbott's quote when he was Prime Minister of the people as king in their car. This is the mayor of Bogota, not exactly the richest city in the world, but he said, you know, a development country is a place where the poor have cars. It is where the rich use public transport. Well, you know, we've got to get the politicians. I know apparently Berejiklian catches public transport, but her vision seems to be privatised transport, and that's driven every one of her decisions on public transport. But the privatisation of the city is a disease. It's the sale of High Street and all the public housing, Millers Point, can only be described as a purge and an attack on the rights of the city. High Street is a project that Peter, John and I have written about and we've researched and taken walking tours on for many years. It's part of this great urban project of the Harbour Trust, where they built, in fact, one of the first kindergartens in Australia, the public housing. They rebuilt the site, they built the wharves, they built Hickson Road, 100-foot Hickson Roads, 50-foot High Street, all on axis of the tower of the observatory. This incredible piece of scenographic planning of the city that was actually functionally incredibly important, because it actually was a double-storey system, so it allowed the loading of the wharves at 2 levels simultaneously. So this incredible work, which is just being decimated, first in the 1970s, but now flogged off shamefully. And I don't know how many of you have been to Waterloo. Anybody been there on the weekend? Go. All of you, now, go there, because this is one of the most beautiful, evocative art installations in the 2 towers. And I will stop to read Lefebvre's wonderful book that writes to the city. And it said, the right to the city manifests itself as a superior form of rights. Right to freedom, the right to the individual to take part in society, to habitat and to inhabit. The right to the earth, to participation and appropriation, clearly distinct from the right to property. And we live in a period where real estate is our only conception of the city. They're implied in the right to the city. The right to the city cannot be conceived as a simple visiting right or as a return to traditional cities. It can only be formulated as a transformed and renewed right to urban life. Why are we driving the more disadvantaged members of our society from our city centre instead of looking after them? We are in the centre of one of the richest cities in the world, in one of the richest countries in the world, and we have been for 150 years. What is our excuse? What is the excuse for selling the public housing at Millers Point that was built by far-sighted public authorities in 1910, that has been maintained through World War, through depression, through boom and bust, through different left and right ideologies? It's been maintained, this government, which is swimming in $8 billion out of stamp duty just from the city centre, Why does it see the need to sell public housing, which 100 years of public authorities have seen it as their responsibility to maintain and support? It is shameful, and as is the situation with homelessness in the city, which is a growing problem. And these are important things as professionals to speak up loud and clearly about. Of course, the sale of the sandstone, one of my great heroes, Jack Mundy, campaign, and this might be one of the last times he spoke in public about the sale of these two buildings, the Department of Lands and the Education Department. And the minister said, it makes no sense to waste these sandstone buildings housing bureaucrats on prime CBD real estate. CBD, I thought it was the centre of the city. I thought it was the public centre, the transport centre, the tourist centre, the events centre, the religious centre, the retail centre, actually the residential centre. I thought it was the centre of all of our cities, all of our conception of the city. I don't think it's like a mine where in fact the real estate industry and developers see it as simply a ground to exploit and leave degraded. So I will never use the term CBD except as a term of derision. And I think it seems to have been a term that was coined in America in the 60s, was trying to work out when that was. But this is again in complete contrast to the values which have, this site has never been sold, had been in public ownership since 1788, if not for millennia before, in communal ownership. And this building was built by New South Wales when it attained self-government in 1856 in order to regulate the travesty of land speculation and the squattocracy. And at the centre of this building is the plan room, which is here. And not only has the government sold the actual physical buildings, can you believe it, for $35 million, 2 city blocks, knocked down price. One crummy mansion in Point Piper gets more than that. And they've sold 150 years of our, 170 years of our heritage. And they've sold also the land and property agency. So the other essential function sold. Sorry, Helen, I'll be quick. Darling Harbour. I had the misfortune of working on that as my first project. I had staying up all night for Laurie Brereton. We've had a complete litany of stupid ministers in New South Wales. It's worth calling them out. It'd be a great lecture. I'm sure James could give it. But what a dumb city we are, a disposable city. Here 25 years later, we just knock it all down again and build it again. Build more trash that you'll be coming back in 25 years and knocking down again because it's rubbish. And it's going to be even more rubbish. This isn't even part of the project. And if you go down to Darling Harbour now, for the first time there's actually a relationship through to the water from the city about to be lost by this obscene construction. But I'll just finish on Barangaroo, Helen, if you just bear with me. No excuses for selling Sydney out for the uglification of the city. And we are in, I think, the most rapacious period in our history. Even beats Askin. Gee, that's really low. And Barangaroo is really the bastardisation of the public interest and the abdication of the public interest by successive governments, Lib and Lab. What's the difference? And we have to put up with this sort of nonsense, this sort of spin and hype. I mean, they actually said these things. We're for Sydney. Jamie Packer, really? Where do you live? And aren't you trying to buy Israel? And aren't you on a boat in the Mediterranean? And then look at Lend-Lease. Oh, they're so concerned about us. Oh, dear. The hypocrisy is really too much. And here's Sydney REP that says actually, you know, that all the harbour lands have to be for public good, not for private gain. And yet they put the casino on the foreshore, hogging the foreshore. And this is endemic, this is systemic, and I want to show you this drawing in particular because this is the crappy planning version of our competition winning scheme, which actually is the public, which was the planning document with the public domain drawn. This is in the Act. This is their public domain. I've blown it up. Here's the legend. Headland Park, public domain. Do you see any? No. Who signed it? Oh, Christina Keneally, as planning minister, signed it. No public domain in the Act. If this isn't corruption of one sort or another, and if Barangaroo isn't, like Darling Harbour, isn't a manifestation of systemic corruption of the public values of the city, and if we can't as professionals call that out loud and clear to the society, well then we're failing in our job. This is such a parody. This is their own sign. I've only found one street and it's the darkest, meanest street ever built in Sydney. It's the narrowest, it's the most overshadowed. You're right next to the water and you wouldn't even know it's there. That's not what we envisaged. We envisaged that as part of the city, that we deliberately drew our scheme so it would disappear with Jane and Paul, and Laura and Michael and other people in the audience. So it would, in a sense, make the entire public foreshore of Sydney complete. And so that it would actually, you wouldn't be able to tell where the project was. But what we said to the jury, and this is just an excerpt, and Helen was on the jury, that we said a grand harbourside park, half the site, because that was the requirement, a great new Sydney street. I'll just run through it quickly. Half the park, half that site area, 11 hectares of the 22 hectares plus the area of the streets. So that's 73% of the site as public space, when they're struggling to get 50, including the streets, and that's when Keating can walk on the water, which wasn't required in our scheme. The streets make blocks, the block can divide into lots, and you can get many buildings. What we said to the jury, what we think we won, is one plan, hundreds of elements, authentic diversity, the work of many hands, a robust project. And what we also said was that the foreshore, because we knew what the problems of working in Sydney were, inalienable public space. Well, that's the exact opposite of what's happened at Barangaroo. And it has to be something we never tolerate again in the city. And so we see the public space of the city as actually the physical manifestation of democratic society itself. And we have to uphold those values and we have to champion them for the public. Thank you very much.